So, Holly Grochmal from Pandora and SiriusXM, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about how your company sees the consumer across connected devices. Maybe even give us a little bit of a sense for do they differ with their on-demand behaviors and how they see privacy and data flows?
Sure. So I think, we saw a big uptick during the pandemic, as a lot of other companies in the space saw, especially around the connected devices and speakers. And we've really noticed that that's, been sticky, right? From a consumer perspective, we've been in the space for a long time. We're on a new number of different consumer electronic devices. And when I talk to my team about it, I think of privacy, foremost, right? When we look at it, we work with our product teams a lot. And so I kind of have our teams do a little bit of a check, right? So who's actually collecting the data? Let's do a data map, right? Because it could be us as the app, right? Or it could be the actual device where, you're using, right? Whatever CE device that is, the smart speaker, the connected device. And so we look at who's actually collecting the data, what data is being collected, who's going to use that data, right? So it may be us, it may be the device itself. Are we going to be sharing it amongst each other or with third parties? And then start looking at where can we actually put that privacy notice, right? So is there a screen? If there's a screen, what the space is for the screen? If, is an app that's already downloaded and preloaded on the device, or is there going to be a download part of it? So I think it's holistically looking at the particular device, how that can be interfaced, and really thinking about what the consumer is going to want and what's important for the consumer as well.
That's great. That's good perspective to have, especially with the kind of background that you all have in the space. Really salient stuff. As you think about kind of your end consumer, and you're right, in your business, that could be the app, it could be my car, it could be something else, a smart speaker, et cetera. And so you all really have footprint in a lot of places that are kind of interesting. How does the consumer, do you think, feel about or want when they are interacting with you, with the singular entity, but across these touch points?
Sure. So, I always go back to, what does the consumer want, right? So let's go to our baseline, right? We want to make sure that there's transparency, that the consumer knows what's happening, right? So kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, knowing what the data flow is, knowing who's collecting the device and how they're using it, right? And then giving the consumer choice, consent, clarity as to what's actually happening with that information. Now, I think there's instances where it's beneficial to customers for, as a consumer, that I want that device to kind of know and talk with the other devices, right? Maybe I don't want to hear the same ad 10 times on my mobile device and hear the same ad on my CE speaker, right? And so having things like frequency capping or sequential ads that, I want to hear the next part of the ad may be useful to consumers. So again, giving that consumer the choice and making sure that we have the consent and they have the transparency to know how that information is doing, and then let the consumer be the driver as to how that information is shared and used amongst the devices and the apps.
That's great. This is a little off script, but since you brought up sequential ads, just for our own edification here, are you seeing a big uptick in that?
I think there's a lot of new formats that are happening, right? Some sequential ads, there's a lot of things going on with voice enabled right now. I know we've talked a little bit about lean in and lean back advertising in the past. Yeah. And, we're seeing, a lot of new formats that are coming up that people are testing, right? And kind of seeing what consumers are interested in, what brands want to support. And I think kind of going back, for me and for my team, and I think in the industry, just continue to stay abreast of what's happening with those developments and how does privacy impact them, right? I think we're going to start seeing a lot more usages in car, right? Not just from an entertainment perspective, but we're going to start seeing more e-commerce occurring in the vehicle, especially with autonomous driving. So, these issues aren't going to go away. And it's not a one size fits all approach. I know Lou, you and I have talked about this in the past, but and I think that's why it's so important for our industry to, understand how these things work too. And that's kind of why, I always start with, the data map, creating the data map, knowing who's doing what data is being collected, and then being able to translate that into something that the consumers understand. Because I think there's a lot of confusion still in the space as to what's being collected, how it's being used. And so the more that you can create, as brands, as advertisers, that trust with your consumers via, having the transparency and giving the control to the consumer, I think we all end up benefiting.
That's great, Holly. One last question, then we'll get you out of here. But we'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about the consumer experience, maybe even the UI that you all use to help with that. How do you, manufacture that experience for the consumer so that you are getting as close as possible to him or her?
Yeah, and it depends, right? And each situation is going to be unique depending on how the app is integrated, what device is integrated, right? So there's so many different options. I think, again, if you can get as close as you can to, first in time with the user, so that they, they are informed as rapidly as possible. And then, depending on the constraints of, is there a screen? Is there limitations around that, right? Is it only audio? There's a number of things I think that as an industry we're looking at right now, whether it's, linking back to a longer privacy policy and just having a short notice. Do you do an audio disclaimer? Do you do something in the device settings? There's a lot that can possibly, different options and points too. And there's a lot going on, I think, too, just as an industry, we're in audio, but there's a lot of things going on in podcasting, right? As well, that we've talked about a little bit in the past too. And podcasting is a unique situation too, because you have a whole host of different players. You have the actual, podcast content creators. So you could have Lou's, DAA Privacy Hour is the podcast. And then, you've got your own hosting service is actually can be dynamically stitching in the ads. And then you separately have the podcast distribution platform. So, Apple, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, whomever it is. And that ecosystem is very different too. So you have to look, I think, again, kind of going back, it's not a one size fits all approach. You really need to understand the devices, the apps, how the consumer is using it, and then kind of going back to the framework of being able to give transparency and choice to the consumers.
That's great. And I think fundamentally for all of us, we still need to do the homework, right? You kept pointing to the data map, but that's really foundational in there because it does point where you have that consumer touch point, where you have that data touch point, and how do you go from those places to where you need to satisfy a lot of constituencies, including the consumer themselves. So thank you very much, Holly, for a terrific session here today. And thanks to all the folks in San Diego for joining us. And then we'll look forward to seeing you again soon in the near future.
Thanks, Lou.